Good afternoon and welcome to the 762nd meeting of the Economic Club of New York. I'm Barbara Van Allen, President and CEO of the club. Recognized as the premier nonpartisan forum for discussions on social, economic, and political issues, the club has now over more than a century hosted over 1,000 prominent guest speakers, and that tradition of excellence continues up to and includes today. I want to extend a warm welcome to students joining us today from Fordham University, Columbia University, and of course, Harvard University, as well as members of our largest ever class of 2024 fellows, a select group of diverse, rising, next-gen business thought leaders. Today, we're honored to welcome back two of America's leading economists and EC&Y club members, Glenn Hubbard and Larry Summers. As I always say, they really need no introduction, but let me briefly introduce them to our new members and guests today. Glenn is the Russell L. Carson Professor of Finance and Economics at Columbia University, previously served as the Dean of Columbia University's Graduate School of Business from 2004 to 2019. He also was chair of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors from 2001 to 2003 and chair of the Economic Club of New York from 2007 to 2010. Currently, he's on the boards of ADP, BlackRock Fixed Income Funds, co-chair of the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation, and MetLife, where he is chair. Larry Summers is the Charles W. Eliot University Professor and President Emeritus of Harvard University, and the Weil Director of the Mosavar Ramani Center for Business and Government at Harvard's Kennedy School. He served in a series of senior policy positions in Washington, including as the 71st Secretary of the Treasury for President Clinton, Director of the National Economic Council for President Obama, and Vice President of Development Economics and Chief Economist of the World Bank. Currently, he chairs the board of the Center for Global Development and serves as vice chair of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Larry is an advisor to business and investors and serves on the board of Block, Doma, OpenAI, and Skillsoft Corporation. The format today will be a conversation. We're going to end promptly at 1 o'clock. Any questions that were submitted have been shared and may be addressed during the conversation. In addition, we will have the chat box open for this conversation, and you can enter questions there, time permitting. They will see if they can use those. As a reminder, this conversation is on the record, and we do have plenty of media on the line. Gentlemen, if you're ready, I'm happy to pass this time over to you, perhaps starting with Glenn.
Thanks so much, Barbara, and thanks to everyone for joining. And as Barbara said, Larry and I will keep our eye out for questions in the chat and turn to them. Larry, when you and I were talking about this, we understood there's a lot going on for us economists. That's probably a good thing. And I think we could talk easily about a lot of topics. The ones we really touched on were monetary policy, tax policy, industrial policy, the 2025 economic agenda, whoever the president of the United States turns out to be, and also a little bit about our life in the university and what's going on with academic freedom and campus protests. And I'm sure many other things will pop up. If I might start on monetary policy, I'll ask you a question and then chime in. It's true that markets have sort of moved in the direction of many of us as economists who said it was a bit optimistic to think a lot of rate cuts were in the offing, yet still markets tend to be perhaps a little bit more sanguine than some economists looking at the data. What do you see as the outlook both for inflation and rate changes from the Fed?
So let me start with an analytic judgment. Glenn, recognizing that nobody knows and nobody can be certain, and that there's probably been a little evidence that would modulate the view that I'm about to express in the last week or so. My best guess is that the neutral rate of interest is in the 4.5% range. That is radically different from what the Fed says when they say 2.6. And if correct, has very substantial implications for monetary policy. If the neutral rate at present is in the range of 4.5%, then monetary policy is not substantially restrictive. There's no compelling warrant for easing monetary policy, and markets should be getting used to rates in current ranges for the foreseeable future, and probably long rates above current levels, because long rates are discounting a very small term premium and a fair amount of Fed cutting. And if neutral rate really is 4.5%, that view is substantially off. Why do I think neutral rate is in the range of 4.5%? I would make three broad categories of argument. First, if you just look at economic performance above potential, economies run at potential or close to potential in terms of finance for quite some time, and it's been a while since the last rate increase. We haven't yet had a month when employment growth was slower than underlying population growth drives the labor force. Financial conditions, which are a kind of broader forward-looking measure of the environment, are now on some measures looser than they were tightening. So if you look at either activity, or you look at employment, or you look at financial conditions, they're telling you that the neutral rate is somewhere not wildly different than the current rate. Second way of looking at the neutral rate is to take a market judgment and look beyond the current moment and look at what markets are saying interest rates are going to be 5 years out. And if you look at forward rates in the 5 to 10 years out range, that's some number in fours as a number. And of course, those estimates, those forward rates reflect the term premium, but most of the best term premium models, and none of them are hugely convincing, but those estimates suggest that term premiums are currently zero or negative. So there's no large adjustment that needs to be made. So market adjustments are suggesting that. A third way of going at this is to look at the kinds of factors impacting the savings investment balance that were central when I and others diagnosed secular stagnation and diagnosed the phenomenon of a substantially declining neutral rate in the post-financial crisis period. It seems to me that if you take where we were in 2018 or 2019, when the Fed thought the neutral rate was 2.6%, the following things have happened. Most importantly, the country has a quite different fiscal posture than it did then. You can debate exactly how to measure it. My judgment would be that cyclically adjusted deficits extracting from year-to-year fluctuations are now 2 to 3% of GDP higher than they were then. We have also launched substantial programs to stimulate green investment, leading to substantial volumes policies and by market reassessments. There is an increased emphasis on resilience, leading to larger domestic volumes of investment. And finally, as I've seen with my OpenAI hat in the last months, there's clearly been an upward assessment in the demand for compute, with substantial implications also for electricity needs and electricity production. My assessment would be that the deficit is 2 to 3%, and that these other factors are perhaps another couple of percent. So I see a 4, perhaps 5% change in the savings investment balance relative to what one would have judged in 2018 or 2019. Economists don't have any very strong idea as to just how interest sensitive spending is, but offset 4% increase, 4% of GDP increase in demand, maintaining the same level of full employment, it would be a conservative estimate that 2% on interest rates would be enough to do that, suggesting again a substantial increase in the neutral interest rate. So to sum up, Glenn, my judgment would be we need to adjust ourselves to a 4.5% neutral rate as a reasonable best guess. That probably means less Fed cutting than is now anticipated, and that's probably what it should be.
Yeah, I would broadly agree with those points, Larry. I do think inflation at the moment is stuck well above the Fed's 2% inflation target. I know there's some points of view that it's really a measurement issue with things like shelter inflation, but if we're going to talk about PCE, less food and energy, that's that. And even the shelter inflation numbers coming down a bit are still higher than they were on a year-over-year basis. And indeed, at current shelter inflation, everything else would have to be 0 to get you to 2%. So I think we're not at a good level. I agree with you. If you look at the labor market and sum up actual jobs and job openings, the labor market still is holding up fairly well. There's some weakening, and I expect some weakening in the employment numbers we'll see on Friday. But broadly speaking, that seems to be holding up well. The economy is growing above most economists' measures of potential. At the same time, it strikes me that there are a number of implications of this view. One, it might have been surprising a few months ago to just not see a recession in the offing with this. If you were to say to me, let's raise rates really fast to a different level and hold them there and not see a recession, that might be unusual. I do think we're going to see an economic slowdown coming, and planes don't stay in the sky forever. They land. They either land softly or not softly, but they do land, and I expect a relatively soft landing, but a landing it will be. I think there are also other implications, and you touched on some of them. An important one is the fisc. It's very different borrowing money at near 0 and borrowing money at 5% when you have very large structural deficits. And I think we're only beginning to have that conversation as interest payments exceed payments the defense interest payments exceed national defense. And then finally, there could still be implications in financial markets that we haven't seen yet from interest rates at this level. So net, I think a slowdown is coming, but I don't see a very large recession. One other factor I would mention and get your take on all of the above is politics. I'm really worried about politics and the Fed. I mean, there are Fed chairs who've been appointed by Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, but they're technocratic individuals who do their jobs, whether you or I would agree with everything they do. I'm much more worried about politics, actually from both of the major party candidates. And I do think the Fed's independence remains important. But I'd love to get your take on the growth, the fisc, politics, any of that on the Fed.
Yes, on the Fed's independence. I've certainly over time been critical of certain aspects of the Biden administration's economic policy, but I would say they have been much, much, much better on issues related to Fed independence than President Obama. The gap is even greater with the kinds of President Trump has said about his intentions in office. So I'd agree with you on independence of the Fed, but I would reject any idea of symmetry of sin in that regard. I think I'm a little less certain than you are about the slowdown in growth, though the data in the last little while has come in on the soft side, but we'll have to see how all of that plays out. I agree with you that we're not at the 2% inflation target, and I don't think we're on a convincing trajectory to the 2% inflation target. There's an analytic point to be made here, which is that if you believe that there was a significant transitory element in inflation because of bottlenecks, for example, a corollary of that view is that prices went up faster than some underlying rate of inflation as certain relative price went up, the price of his cars, for example. Then, when those bottlenecks ease, those prices go down. And just as measured inflation exceeds underlying inflation when prices are during the bottleneck period, during the debottlenecking period, underlying inflation is greater than measured inflation. And so it's been noteworthy to me that the advocates of the transitory inflation theories have not drawn that implication and have been in a bit too much of a hurry to declare it. So from my perspective, never really were a 7% inflation country or anything like that. We probably got up to being a 4.5% or 5% inflation country in an underlying sense. And there's been some flattery in the figures as the transitory factors have reversed. So I don't think it's anything like right to say that we're most done. Maybe a getting inflation down to 2%. I think that you're right in emphasizing fiscal sustainability. CBO baseline that everybody relies on in Washington assumes a 2.7% 3-month T-bill in the late 1920s and early 1930s. That certainly happened, and I wouldn't be confident that that would happen. But it's hard to believe that 2.7 for the T-bill rate is a number with two-sided error around it. If you sort of ask yourself, can you envision 4.7%? Yes, I think I just made that case in a reasonable way. Can you imagine sustained 0.7%? Yes, I can imagine that, but it seems to me to be a far greater leap of the imagination. So I think we're in a situation where the fiscal forecasts that people are using are too serene on interest rates, too serene in relying on the current law assumption that the Trump tax cuts will be phased out. From my perspective, bizarre in assuming that real national defense spending adjusted for inflation, will decline in coming years, given everything that we face. So I think the fiscal sustainability is not being recognized in a full way in any part of the political spectrum.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think when I was referring to slowdown, one of the things I was concerned about is I take the Fed seriously on the 2% inflation target, and a 2% inflation target in a reasonable period of time, which would mean the Fed will have to slow the economy down. There will have to be some more demand destruction than we've seen. But I want to change the channel of taxes because we both brought it up. 2025 is going to see a big tax discussion, not because you or I care about it, but because of the expiration of parts of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. And that bill, or that law, of course, did have very significant reductions in corporate taxes. Many economists believe that was very good for investment, maybe modestly good for growth. It also had some things that raised some concerns of a lot of temporary tax provisions, some of the tax treatment of multinational companies. There's arguments on both sides. Many of the provisions, particularly individual provisions, are up for grabs. Wanted to just get your take on what do you think we should be talking about in 2025 in reforming the law, whether it's corporate changes, which needn't happen but could, and individual changes that must happen.
Look, I think that things that one of the other realities that I think people have insufficiently faced is that whatever you think about the size of government, different people will have different values. I've traditionally been for more government than you've been. For Glenn, Milton Friedman was for much less government than Jim Tobin was for the earlier generation. But whatever your values are, I think you have to recognize that a much larger fraction of the population is old than used to be the case, that the relative price of the things government buys has gone way up. Think about the price of a year in college versus the price of a television set. According to the CPI, the relative price has changed by a factor of 100 over the last 40 years. And so with more aged people, the government buys having gone up, unless we've had a substantial ideological government, the size of government is going to have to go up. And that means that I think as a country, we need more tax revenue, not less. And it's not realistic to think that on net, we can cut taxes from current levels. And in all likelihood, taxes are going to have to rise. My judgment would be that the Business Roundtable position for many years was that a 25% corporate tax rate would be a terrific outcome from the point of view of corporate America. I think they were right. And I think raising the corporate tax rate to something in the 25 to 28% range would be in the country's economic interest. I think that there are a variety of provisions affecting master limited partnerships and the like that do more to create tax shelters than they do provide benefit. The world of international tax provisions is very complex, but I think the best globalization policy the United States has done in the last half dozen years was the treaty reach countries to avoid corporate tax sheltering in tax havens, and that the failure of Congress to pass in full the implementing legislation was costly. And I think we should go back to that and tighten up on international tax shelters. By my lights, some limited increase in top individual rate and probably appropriate. That at some point we are going to have to get over the political taboo that revenues can be raised only from the top 1% of the population, and find ways of raising taxes more broadly. I, like most economists, have the orientation to broadening the base rather than to the rates. And I don't think any discussion without emphasizing the importance of that we have, and remind that in a world where the IRS, one recent period, allowed 100 people with incomes over 10 file returns, and then allowed to see anybody doing anything. That's an insufficient effort at tax enforcement. And I think we need to strengthen our system of tax enforcement, even as we work to promote better tax service. So I think we've got to approach this with nuance and also with realism that we are going to need more tax revenue in the future.
Yeah, I think you've teed up some really good themes, Larry. I would break it up into two conversations. One would be the literal 2025 TCJA fix conversation, and the other, the longer term, about the size of government. On TCJA, we can't just extend it. It's $3.8 trillion over 10 years. All the arrows, as we would both agree, are pointing up in terms of defense spending. I don't know if 5% of GDP is the right number, but where we are now clearly isn't the right number. And interest payments on the debt, per our earlier conversation, are going to be higher. So that's just not a cocktail that mixes well. That said, when I look at the 2025 conversation, while I agree, if one had to, one could modestly raise the corporate rate. It's certainly not where I would start. In the individual side, I would try to focus extending tax cuts for middle income people, not for upper income people, and do some base broadening on the individual side of the code. You could get close to a revenue neutral extension of TCJA with some of that. But the bigger question, as you said, is about the size of government. While you and I may not agree on what that ought to be, I think we both agree you should pay for it, whether it's a smaller one or a larger one. If the public wants a larger government, I'm afraid TCJA and that discussion isn't the right discussion. We either need to have a discussion about a new tax system, which would be a broader income tax base or a consumption tax, and or a significant restructuring of the entitlement programs. Those are the only two discussions to have. As you said, I don't think it's possible to imagine getting out of the fiscal hole solely on the backs of the well-to-do. There's just not, rich people are rich as individuals, but taken together, there's just not enough money there. So the public has to be willing to have a conversation, whether it's on the tax side or on the benefits side, but that's a conversation we have to have. I don't know if you had other thoughts.
No, look, I think that, in a way, you can't quite bring yourself to say phrases like larger government, but in a way, you're making very much the point that I was trying to make, which is if we want to provide the level of protection to aged people that we traditionally have, in a world where the fraction has risen substantially, and in a world where the relative price of healthcare has gone up substantially, then we have to have the share of revenue that is devoted to that go up substantially. And so what does the government do? It does taking care of the aged. We agree that that's up, or we have to accept some quite different social contract than the one we've had for a long time. We agree that because there's more debt and because of the views we share about interest payments are going to go up. We agree, much as we both regret it, that defense spending is going to have to go up, not by the standards of the long term back to where it was in the 50s or 60s, but that defense spending is going to have to go up from where it's been in recent years, given the magnitude of national security threats. What else is there? What there mostly is the so-called domestic discretionary part of the budget, which has already been very substantially cut relative to GDP, and in any event, just isn't very big. It's less than 3% of GDP, and that's everything from the IRS to the FBI to the national parks. Are there different social content than the one we've had for a long time, and the one that basically served the Reagan administration? Or we're going to need to have more tax revenue collected. And I agree with you I differ with you in that I'm probably prepared to be a little bit more aggressive and vis-a-vis high-income individuals and those as more and doing less damage to incentives than you do. So we have some difference there. But I think we would both agree that even on that you could send some desirable.
I think you're cutting out as you were talking about high income people. So I'm going to take the ball back and just say that I do think that we're zoning here on an agreement that what you've called a social contract, if a social contract is the vast majority of people will pay less in taxes and get large social spending, well, that may be called a social contract, but the math doesn't work. So we either have to have a smaller social spending, more focused on the truly needy, or a tax increase that's broadly shared. But to call a social contract something that doesn't work in math, I'm not sure that works. But I want to change the channel to industrial policy.
I'm sorry, Glenn, I was not making that mistake. In fairness to me, I was not making that mistake. I was defining the social contract as Social Security and Medicare in the broad way they have existed for the last 40 or for the last 45 years, including through the Reagan administration. And yes, there you can achieve the balance we're both talking about either by scaling those things back in ways that people really talked about seriously politically, singular, and that even Ronald Reagan didn't really choose to talk about an attempt. That is an approach. Or the alternative approach involves raising revenue. And those are both ways of satisfying the arithmetic, and you and I agree that the arithmetic has to be satisfied.
Sadly, the bipartisan consensus at the moment is that the arithmetic be damned. But I want to go to another bipartisan consensus, which is on industrial policy, where the two sides are using different words, but are both talking about a fundamental departure from the kind of neoliberal policies that both Democratic and Republican presidents had followed for some time. That's not just true in the United States. Industrial policy is back in a big way, even in countries that it had disappeared from for a while. How should we think about this from an economic perspective? And what could go right and what could go wrong?
You know, my view about industrial policy, Glenn, is that it's a little bit like industrial policy advocates are a little bit like generals. The best generals hate war, but recognize that it's occasionally necessary and are prepared to fight it when it's necessary. And I do think it's important to recognize that in a world of very complex supply chains, that there are important national security implications to the composition of the economy, and that a responsible government has to not just leave all of that to market forces. And I think that's right. I think that in a world where there are large scale effects, that there are, and where there are important chicken and egg problems, who will make electric cars if there are no charging stations? Who will make charging stations if there are no electric cars? There are chicken and egg problems where I think the public sector does have an important role. I would to be reflexively opposed to industrial policy. Equally, I think it's a mistake not to be very tough-minded in undertaking industrial policy. I have a rough rule of thumb. Any industrial policy advocate who doesn't talk at all about the jobs that are going to be created by their industrial policy and only talks about the national security or technology promotion benefits, I'm prepared to listen hard to. Any industrial policy advocate who focuses on the word jobs and makes extensive use of the word middle class, I'm in much more of a hurry to reach for my wallet. So I don't want to be completely doctrinaire about this, and I think that that is a that's a real mistake. And I think it's important to remember that the Trans-Pacific Railroad was a good thing, and it was an industrial policy of a kind. The interstate highway system was a good thing, and it was an industrial policy of a kind. It was a policy of a. So I want to not be part of some economic war against the idea of industrial policy, but I think we've got to be very tough-minded about why we're seeking to override market forces, very tough-minded of making sure we're doing it in the least market interfering way when we do it, and very tough mind about the collateral consequences. Whenever I become enthusiastic about an industrial policy, I think to myself, the Jones Act, which today is a ludicrous increase in prices that is hurting New England, that has hurt the Caribbean, that has made our economy more fragile by reducing the capacity in the shipping industry. That was the enlightened industrial policy of its day, and it's still with us 100 years later. As we undertake these policies, I think we need to be careful about thinking about the political dynamics they're setting in motion. But I don't think it's right. I think one has to find a middle ground between the joyous and excited discoverers of vast new roles for government and the cynics who are just viscerally in opposition because it's not the market, given the structure of today's economy.
I think you've teed up a lot of great points there, Larry. The way I think about industrial policy at the moment is that we need to be both more general and more specific than what we're doing now. So you mentioned the Transcontinental Railroad, for example, or the interstate highways. That's an example of government using its role in a general way to create large public good benefits. So in the contemporary economy, I would think of that as massive increases in basic research that could spill over. The defense buildup that we've talked about earlier in the conversation may well generate those sorts of research externalities for the private sector. That to me seems all to the good, and also more specific in the sense that if there are bona fide national security arguments, they're probably very narrow and very specific. And the use of national security, I think, really covers for an agenda that may have less to do with national security and more having to do with insulating certain groups in the economy or industries or regions from disruption. And there are better ways to deal with that than industrial policy or protectionism, even though those are legitimate concerns. I guess one of my biggest concerns about industrial policy has always been one of the points you made, which is about exit. It's easier to start something than to pull it away. When you have market forces, entry and exit occur naturally. I enter if there's money to be made in doing so, and I exit when I no longer can. It's different in industrial policy in a way that's unsettling. So I think if we're going to do a route that's where the administration is right now, we're going to have to, work a little bit harder to find a way to monitor to exit. So I think that's going to be a much bigger deal. But I don't know what you think.
Glenn.
Are you on?
Yes, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I was just making the comments about industrial policy needing to be more general, specific. Exits are needed. Any further thoughts on that?
I think higher. I think as usual and in broad rate fair Trans-Pacific Railway, the CHIPS Act. It was a specific project that did a particular thing. It wasn't really our basic research, and so
You cut out a bit. My point there was simply that in the contemporary economy, basic research, take the CHIPS Act as an example, basic research is needed, perhaps large subsidies to incumbent firms, perhaps a little bit less so. But we can move on. Before we get to the post-election agenda, I wanted to ask you something going into the election. Why do you think so many Americans are unhappy about the economy, even if much of the data you or I might look at tells a different story? To my mind, it's probably a mixture of things about inflation being very high for a period of time. We can say inflation's coming down, but the arc of inflation, sort of 2019 to the present, has concerned many Americans. Concerns about immigration and concerned about fiscal challenges. What do you think is in this cocktail? Why are people so unhappy?
I think you and I are focused on fiscal challenges. The bond market's not all that focused on fiscal challenges, and I don't think Americans at their kitchen tables are all that focused on fiscal challenges. Perhaps they
We're not hearing your audio.
Can you hear me now, Glenn?
Yes.
Glenn, I was saying that I think the impact of higher interest rates on car payments, on mortgage payments, on credit card payments has raised the cost of living as it's experienced by families, even if those things do not show up as part of the consumer price index.
No, that's a very good point. So if I may, let's go from how people feel now to a post-election agenda. Barring some oddity of RFK Jr. becoming president, it's going to be the current president, Joe Biden, or the past president, Donald Trump. How should we think about their economic agendas? What's different about them? What's similar about them? I have my own thoughts, but I'll start with you.
Look, I think the Trump economic agenda is really very highly problematic on the inflationary side. Between the disrespect for the independence of the Fed, the strong signals about the desirability of a weak dollar, the desire for tax cutting absent any programmatic commitment to spending cutting, the imposition of unprecedented in the last half century tariff policies, that there is likely the restrictions on labor supply through immigration. I think the Trump economic agenda is likely to be very substantially inflationary from here. And I'm not sure I see any real economic problem, slowing economic growth, that the Trump administration has talked in a serious way about addressing on a go-forward basis. So I find that economic agenda to really be quite alarming in terms of inflation and financial stability. I wish the Biden administration agenda was more spelled out. I would like to hear more about plans for fiscal sustainability. I'm concerned about the degree of interventionism in the economy. But I think there is much more recognition that we need to respect our central bank and respect our currency. I think there is less instinct to pervasive, large-scale protectionism and an approach. I think there's substantially more commitment to research and development, for competitiveness in key technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence or whether it's clean energy. So I am much more optimistic about the economic prospect on that agenda than I am on the Trump agenda as it now appears.
Yeah, I think you certainly touched on some of the differences. I might put it slightly different. Let me start with where I think the two are similar, and they're often similar in ways I don't like, to be honest. So similar in advocacy of protectionism. You pointed to inflationary effects of tariffs, but of course, while that's true, President Biden too is embracing that agenda. So the similarities are about things that are perhaps less good from an economic policy sense. On differences, I think there are some pronounced differences. In tax, I think there will be big differences both in how TCJA is approached, and as we talked about, it has to be approached in 2025. I don't know that either one plans any kind of long-term discussion. I'd be surprised if that happened. Regulation is another big difference. The Trump administration was a period of much less regulatory activity than the Biden administration has been. So I know past isn't necessarily prologue, but that I would expect to be a big difference. And the Inflation Reduction Act, which unlike the CHIPS Act, has less of a bipartisan support. So I would expect to see a different attitude toward the completion of spending plans in the Inflation Reduction Act, whether President Biden is reelected or President Trump is elected. I spent some time also thinking economically about, are there surprise scenarios we ought to be worried about? So one of them that's on my mind is, could there be a fiscal and financial market reaction to very heavy public spending, tax cutting? We have not seen that, but that's clearly something of worry. Politics in the Fed, I actually do think neither side is doing a great job here, and I do worry about a new Fed chair who's substantially more political than the Fed chair that we have. And neither side seems to be that embracing of how to really integrate AI into the economy. But I don't know if you had any further thoughts on those points or others.
Glenn, we probably both have longstanding traditional loyalties that may be influencing our views here a bit. I would really very strongly reject any suggestion of symmetry of sin on protectionism. Seems to me that there's every reason to think that there will be far more in a Trump administration. All one has to do is read Bob Lighthizer book and to see that. I think there are substantial differences likely in respect for the independence of the Fed, and I think that is pretty consequential. I think it's hard to do broad brush evaluations on total quantities of regulation. I think you have to look issue by issue. And we may have a difference, which is, I really do think that climate change is an existential challenge, that it's central that if the world is going to address it, that the United States be addressing it actively, domestically. And while I would probably prefer more emphasis on higher carbon pricing, I think that there are substantial benefits to providing support through regulation and through subsidy instruments for green technologies. You know, the fact is, Glenn, that while I was very unenthusiastic during the Obama administration about the substantial strengthening of the CAFE standards. Those mandates actually did drive substantial increases in energy efficiency that have had very substantial environmental benefits. And I think it's a mistake that because it's not in the classic corpus of classic economic theory, that we economists probably devote too little attention to the possibility of some desirable technology forcing through regulation. At the same time, there are other areas, certain excesses in the antitrust area, for example, where I would hope that a second Biden administration would be less activist and less regulatory than the first one was.
Well, it's interesting what you say, Larry. I certainly agree that while price signals are the best, sometimes we have to be in the world of the second best. My point on the IRA was really that Trump and Biden are going to be different in how they handle it. On antitrust and Lena Khan, I would note with some irony that Senator J.D. Vance, who's one of the potential contenders to run with Mr. Trump, says that's his favorite Biden appointee. So maybe there's more similarities, again, not necessarily in a good way, in thinking about antitrust. I want to take a minute at the end before Barbara gives us a decane to go to our long-term home of decades, which is university life. And universities are places where ideas come and ideas are debated, and people can and should feel able to disagree. We're seeing across elite campuses all over the country, particularly here at Columbia and particularly at Harvard, this coming to fore. My own view is universities probably were saying too much about a lot of things without thinking them through and without clear time, place, and manner restrictions on how to engage. But I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, look, it's a long subject. I'll just say this. I've been shocked and horrified by the pervasiveness of left-wing anti-Semitism on college campuses. One simple test I use when I hear advocacy of what are hugely legitimate Palestinian grievances against history and against the status quo is, does the advocate mention anything that is hurting the Palestinians other than the Israelis? And if they don't recognize any sin on the part of Hamas, on the part of the Arab world, on other parts, I have to say I become uneasy about their motives. So I think anti-Semitism is shockingly present in American life, much more than I would have expected, and a real problem on college campuses. And I think it's increasingly being normalized. Beyond that, I would just say universities, I think, need some return to tradition. And that means an emphasis on truth more and social justice less, opportunity more and identity politics less, excellence more and mutual self-esteem less. And I think it's important to recognize that pendulums swing, and I suspect there may be a bit of a swing back from the very severe excesses that we saw on a number of campuses this year.
I agree and hope you're right. Let's make Cardinal Newman great again. So Barbara, I see you.
Thank you. And thank you both for a great conversation. I apologize for some of our technical difficulties there, but it's always an honor to host you both. And once again, you did not disappoint. We have many additional great speakers coming forward, believe it or not, in this month of June. June the 10th, we have Oscar Eustace, the artistic director of the Public Theater in New York. On the 13th of June, we will be hosting Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, and she will be receiving the club's award, the Peter G. Peterson Leadership Excellence Award. So that's a very special event, and do try to be there and bring guests if you can. And at the end of the month, we'll wrap up with two events. One will be hosting Strauss Zelnick, the chair and CEO of Take-Two Interactive. Actually, that interview will be done by John Williams, our chair. And then we'll end the season, or at least we think so. We never know what we're going to add, but right now, it looks like we'll wrap up with Lisa Cook on the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve down in Washington. That's June the 25th. So just a reminder, as the presidential election heats up, we'll be inviting both the party nominees to speak after the conventions are completed. So be on the lookout for those events. We actually have some other great events that are lining up nicely for the fall. So do please keep your eye on our calendar, which is, of course, on our website. As always, I want to thank those members of the Centennial Society that join us today for their contributions as they continue to represent the financial backbone of the club and all that we do. So thank you, everyone, for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. And again, thank you both for making today possible. Thank you.